Also, if you would like to make a donation and support the museum, all of the donations are matched by 15%. Please find me after the lecture and I can direct you on where to go if you'd like to make a donation. And without further ado, I would like to welcome you all to our Bruckner lecture.
Hello everyone. Hello everyone. My name is Sebastian Garcia. I am an undergraduate history student at the University of Central Florida. I'm also the podcast producer for the Department of History at the University of Central Florida. And that medium is where I had the absolute pleasure of meeting Dr. Bob Beatty, and we had an amazing interview based on his book, Play All Night, Duane, Allman, and Journey to at Fillmore East. It's a fantastic book, and I can't wait to talk about it more. I say more because in that interview, we talked about it for like 2 hours, and I felt like we were just scratching the surface, so I'm really excited to have you here today. It's a true honor.
Thank you, and I'm going to give some shout outs to my man Sebastian here. So I was originally going to have my dude Troy do this, and I said, hey, Sebastian said he'd be interested again. He goes, you have to do that. So what I want to encourage y'all, if you dig this conversation and you're like, man, I want to hear these two rap a lot more about the Allman Brothers, like it is a podcast that he does to the history department. And by the way, I'm a twice graduate of that history program. I got my bachelor's degree at UCF. I actually didn't have a history degree then. I got my master's there while I was working at this institution, and actually while we opened this institution. So it's a real full circle moment. But I think the best part is my littlest cousins are over in the corner there, and they are the most well-behaved children on the history of the planet, because this is the second time they've come to hear Uncle Bob speak, and I am not worried for a minute. Watch it happen, by the way. But anyway, so I really, I can't even tell you how much it means to me to be in front of y'all. Some of you are very dear friends and have been for a long time, and I've got a high school friend here. I've got two dear friends from college. I've got my very best friend in the world and his parents. I got my Uncle Chuck and Aunt Debbie and cousins, and then my dude Sebastian at this home institution. I see you, Mark Line. I haven't said hello quite yet. Randy Rush, who was chair of the board of directors when I got my start at this institution. So it really means a lot. And we did have a killer conversation. Before I get rolling, my job today is to sell books. I just have to tell you that, okay? I fund my way down here. I am a independent artist, if you will, and books are my albums. So my goal is to play such a great show that you'll buy not just a book for yourself, but a book to give away, because it'll keep this going. And I think I'm gonna get on my soapbox and I'll get off and jump on it back and forth. But these types of conversations are where magic really happens, where people can, music is a conversation about music is very enlightening and instructive. And I've spent my entire life, my entire adult life, unpacking the story that we'll talk about a little bit today that resulted in that book. And I wrote this book not just for the super hardcore Allman Brother nerds like Troy and me, because we talked about this for many years, but for people like Sebastian, who when he first heard it had never heard the Allman Brothers and now loves them, to Troy's mother, who was like, I just really found it an interesting story, or the way that I wrote, and those things mean a lot, and I approached the book that way. So that's my sell. There will be some more, and we'll be selling books in the back when we're done, but your job is to leave here with at least one book for yourself. If you're really happy, you leave with 2 books, and if you're super happy, you give some money to the History Center. You do that anyway, because these institutions are vital to the fabric of our communities. And I fought for this institution very hard early in its days, and I can't be more proud 20 plus years later to be sitting in this room looking at y'all and talking. So there's my intro. And we're blowing jazz here, okay? So I want to explain a quick concept about jazz. Jazz is all about the environment that you're in and paying attention to your bandmates as you go. So for me, a conversation in front of people is listening to what he sends my way and answering a riff. And if he doesn't like it, or he wants to go a different direction, he'll take it a different direction. And Troy and I are going to do this a little bit with guitars. He's twice now today tried to get out of this, and he is not getting out of it. So we will play an example of how Troy and Bob do this music when we're done. Here you go, brother.
All right, so I'm going to ask a couple questions more about the process of the book, and then we'll get into the content of So my first question is, there's a lot of things that make your book distinctively unique about the Allman Brothers Band, but there's three main things that I want you to talk about for the audience that make your book uniquely distinct. And this is in no particular order. So number one is the fandom, your fans' perspective on this book. Number two, it's, you know, a lot of works have been done on this band, as you said in the book, but they were coming at it with a journalistic perspective, and you took the historical route, which is different within itself. And then number three, and probably the most important one, is that you centered the story on Duane's vision on what sound should be, and then at Fillmore East is like the pinnacle embodiment of his vision. So talk to us about those three elements.
So throw the first one at me again.
The fandom.
So, the first thing, the Allman Brothers Band. Okay, I'm gonna go super nerdy on y'all, and you're gonna be like, oh my God, I can't believe this guy keeps this in his head, and I do. This is a really popular American band. Sold tens of millions of records. First ballot Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, which doesn't mean a lot, but it does. You know, rock and roll lists all over the place. You know, this is not a group that hasn't been in the spotlight since this album in 1971, and Duane Allman since he recorded with Wilson Pickett in 1968 when he broke on the national scene. So, but it is a somewhat underground story, and it has never before been approached by anything like a historical perspective, number one, but number two, I'll combine those journalistic things. The people who have written these books before me. So this book is on University Press of Florida. That's intentional. Go Gators. After spurning UF in 1989 for UCF, I finally made it to be officially a Florida Gator. And a University Press is a whole different book in that, and I'm not going to get too detailed, but there is a very rigorous process before that book in front of you sees the light of day. It is not Bob sitting down and writing some ideas. The journalistic approach, I've actually expanded this. The very first one is the two biographies on the Allman Brothers Band were written by journalists who literally sourced them themselves. They sat down with the people, they talked to them, and they were using their own interviews, and in particular the first one, early interviews that had sort of appeared in magazines when the band became really popular and famous. So I hadn't worked the beat. I wasn't a guy walking around to meet the band and listening to the quarterback when he comes off the field and writing notes and stuff like that. Like, I just sat with sources. So getting back to the journalist and the researcher and writer, the hole in this whole thing, and it's anything about writing about music, is how do you tell? Now, I'll use an example, because Bob Ziegenfuss, who's sitting in the middle here, is listening to more Allman Brothers in his life just being around me than he probably ever cared to at that point. Bob has impeccable taste in music. And so I can say it's the greatest thing in the world and listen to it all the time, but somebody else who has musical tastes I trust may not feel that same way. Now, for a time, that was a block, not in Bob and my friendship, but in other friendships out there, right? If you didn't really dig the Allman Brothers, we're gonna go hang out in some other ways. You know, there's a special category for this for me. So that's where this sort of, it's called reception theory. So now I'm gonna get really nerdy. I had a professor and they're like, we're gonna look at this. How do you know that what a band wants to accomplish, they accomplish? Well, you know that, one way to know that is the marketplace, especially in America. They reach success because they sell product. And the next question was, then, is that enough of a measure, right? Then it was, okay, but what are people saying about the band? That's people like us, those of y'all who saw them back in the day at any stage in their 45-year career. But I was focused on their early stuff. So that's where the fans come in. And I start off, the very first line, I think, is like, you need to know I'm not unbiased here. I think that's really important. I think most historians, we will acknowledge our biases way more than anybody else can ever accuse us of. I'm riddled with anxiety and fear about missing something really super obvious. And my fanboy of this band is, you know, I can't help it. I love them. But I had to find a way to let what history, what the record told me, what the primary sources told me, So I had the band already talking. I had the major magazines, Cream Magazine, Rolling Stone, Lester Bangs. I had these biographers and these interviews. What no one had addressed was the fans and what was going on. That fascinates me because that's me. That's us. It's the easiest way to sort of get in. So I think the final piece about how historians and journalists write. Journalists spend a lot of time in history books qualifying their sources constantly. They will say, as Sebastian told Jack Wilson in a 1996 interview for blah, blah, blah. The fact of the matter is, Sebastian said something, and that's way more important to a reader probably than anything else. And I footnote, this book is impeccably footnoted, so every quote in there has a place you can go find that quote. And again, a lot of historians will do that. Journalists don't. They write a story as if it's a story. That's fair, but it does differentiate. Bob Keeling, we heard his name earlier, he was one of those early people I watched in this town and learned the craft of history and how you could make it work in print,
And I told you this in the podcast, and I'll say it again for our audience. I feel like the fact that you took that approach of including the fan's voice and the fan's perspective really allowed me, as someone that was very unknown to the subject matter, attached to it more because I could resonate. Like, I see a fan when I know one. I'm a huge basketball fan. So like, if someone were to write a history of the NBA, for example, and they don't include the fan's voice, I would be a little bummed out about it. So the fact that your fan's perspective was there and was so much alive, I really appreciated that. So talk about why you decided to focus on the sound, on the music in this book.
Yeah, my PhD advisor, probably more than anyone when I went into it, he was like, it's about the blank in music, and that's again, writing about music is like dancing to architecture. I have no idea who said that. Like, I've seen the Zappa said it, I've seen Jerry Garcia said it, blah, blah, blah. Not really certain, but that's the thing that I don't think any other author had done, and I felt like, I'm gonna back up a bit. 1995, this book by Scott Freeman comes out called Midnight Riders, and it was a New York Times bestseller. Despite, by the way, the fact that when he first started shopping it, apparently conventional wisdom in the publishing world was, those people down south don't read. That was in the 80s and 90s. So, we're talking not that long ago, right? So he wrote the book, and he got a pretty bad review in this fan publication that I used to subscribe to by an academically trained historian. And I was working here. No, I wasn't working here yet, I don't think. But I remember the gist of the thing was he doesn't answer why this story is important, which is, I think, another thing a lot of people can accuse journalists of is they're, just put everything out there, but there's no compelling nature to the story, right? What's the sort of why? In this case, you have this transcendent guitarist, Duane Allman, who, when he's given an opportunity to form his own thing, by the way, after three abysmal failures at leaving the South to be successful, somehow decides when he has this opportunity that his best option is to be one of six instead of 1/3, if you will, of a power trio or something where he is 100% the focus. But instead, Oscar Robertson, LeBron James, Magic Johnson, a great guy like him, Derek Trucks is the same way, or like a point guard to me. I'm going to throw in some basketball stuff there. And Steph Curry, I guess, is another one, right? Who can score at any point, but also can make sure that everything's moving forward at all times. So the sound was the thing that hadn't been addressed. It was all about this and this and this and this and this and this. I'm intrigued by the fact that I've been playing guitar now 40 years. When I first heard him, it was 20 years, and I couldn't do anything close to it. It was the most amazing thing I'd heard. I would play, and I would go, ding, bong, bong, bong. Troy knows, like, we'd sit there and we'd hit sour notes, and it was like, oh God, this is terrible. So this guy with all this gift is given the opportunity, and he just slides right into this beautiful situation that he creates and they create. And then there's this idea of egalitarian. So we haven't talked a lot about how the Allman Brothers approach music, but it is very push-pull. It is very much jazz. It's very dependent on the situation around you, the notes your bandmates are throwing you, your mood, their mood, frankly, the temperature in the room, whether people are looking at you or not, or looking at their watches, etc. And then all of that combined with improvisation, all of that combined with the need to be, and this is why the audience is really important, because they had to be in front of an audience to perform their best as their album pointed out. So like all of these factors, the sound became the thing I could do. I call it a biography of the sound. It's a biography of the album at Fillmore East. And I guess we'll talk a little bit about how we came to that record and those things. Okay, so we'll throw it back to you on that one.
And as you were saying that answer, and also as I was re-listening to our podcast episode, one thing that, I was thinking, I was like, it just made much more sense for you personally, like your origins with this band. Like you were fascinated first, not because of the story, because of the sound.
Right.
When you were, back in the 90s in college. So it just I was thinking about it, I was like, that makes much more sense, and I understand why, besides the other things you just pointed out, why you would approach it that way. So, since this is a really cool question that I have for you, since it's a homecoming, you're back here in your origins. How did these experiences in this very building and other experiences like in UCF or just in broader Central Florida area help you or influence the way you approached or wrote this book?
So that's an awesome question. And thank you, by the way, for that summation on sound. And I think that's true. It was ultimately what I was looking for. It was like, what is this sound that I can't explain to anybody else? And I just wanted to explain it to myself kind of deal. Orlando, Central Florida, immeasurable influence on me as a historian as I approach this. So when I came to the story, it was like, I think it was 93. It was the end of my actually the end of my first senior year in college, so I had 5 years, and it was the sound, then it was the story, and I was like, wow, this is really fascinating. Duane Allman dies right as they're breaking big. Barry Oakley dies a year later in a motorcycle accident also. Can you get more Southern Gothic than that tale? And they kept going, and they were big band and this or that, and they were from Florida. That was really cool to me, because when you're here, especially when we would do local history, there was always this idea that there is history here, there's history BD, blah, 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 and yet there's also some history during the Disney era that was really, really significant. When I got to studying the civil rights movement at UCF in graduate school, it was my first grad class, I remember thinking a lot about cooperation during the civil rights era and the ugliness and stuff, and wondering where I'd be and what side would I do, and looking at this band and going, man, there's a black guy in this band at this time. Like, that's not insignificant, is it? Maybe it is. I don't know. And then coming here and really having the opportunity at the History Center to do some really good work that allowed me to stretch my wings a little bit, spread my wings. We had a magazine. Do y'all still have that? Yeah, Reflections. Eric, there you are. Eric was there, and I remember Eric was our development director, and he was like really all over this idea. And Eric was one of those people I trusted. I was like, all right, I'm gonna put my influence on this too, and let's get this damn thing done. And so it's all these steps. I spent a lot of time in libraries. I spent a lot of time in online archives. Y'all, there's an agency of the federal government you don't know a lot about, I'm assuming, the National Endowment for the Humanities. Budget's around $145 million, so what, they're asking for about, 50 cents or something from each of us, I don't know. I've been working with them for years, from this organization to, Nashville, et cetera. But sometime in the 90s, they funded the digitization of college student newspapers. And for a historian of the 1960s and 70s rock and roll and culture, that is an absolute freaking gold mine. So I didn't have to go to North Carolina State and review in their archives. I didn't have to go to American University in DC. I didn't have to go, University of Iowa, where they actually named the field house after Duane Allman after he died. University of Iowa. But I could do it all from my desktop, you know. And here, I'll bring it back here, is access to sources, access to the past, access to making material available, and also keeping the public in mind as you approach your work. It was fine for me that I'm in the book, that you feel a little bit of my spirit in the book. I talked to a friend of mine from UCF, and I remember him telling me, I might have told you this, he said, I said, yeah, I want to put a little of myself back in there. He goes, well, I like books that, you know, don't have that. And I remember thinking, I don't really care what he thinks. This is my book, and I'm going to do it. That was a huge moment for me as a human being and as a scholar to say, I'm going to stand on my own 2 feet and do it my way and hope and take the chances. And by this institution, I mean, I launched from here in 2007. It was a very hard decision to leave Orlando. We had been here for so long, and this place was like anchored for that. And I was the education director, curator of education, I think is still the title. And we did the Highwaymen book. We had the Jack Kerouac scroll was like right here in the room for On the Road. I remember seeing it. We had Fred Shuttlesworth, the civil rights leader, come here and speak on my 33rd birthday. And I cried when I introduced him. It was so powerful to me. And I suppose I thought, all right, how can I tell this one little tiny story through that sort of lens and those experiences?
I'm glad you mentioned that some of the band members were from Florida, and sticking to that Florida theme. When I was reading the book, it felt good, you know, as a Floridian myself, like, yeah, Florida's part of the story. Because oftentimes it's hard to find significance in terms of like the historical sense in Florida. And it was really cool to see that a lot of the most, you know, the biggest milestones of the band kind of happened in Florida. Like their first gig was in Jacksonville. Can you just talk to us a little bit about how crucial this Florida theme was in their story in your book?
I love, thank you for this question. So, born February 19th, 1971, Ocala, Florida. That's the one I want to establish firmly. My pops wasn't born in Florida, but he's been here since 1935. Had, rest in peace. He's actually still here. Pieces of him in the ground there. But I mean, I'm a lifelong Floridian, and you know, Sebastian's absolutely right, I think, and this is true. Historians have long ignored Florida. I think part of the reason is because Florida is a real anomaly. The Florida we live in today is really post-World War II and beyond. Before that, this was a very sparsely, you know, popular. We had less people than Arkansas when World War II started out. Ponder that for just a second. I think we have the fourth largest electoral college. I wanted this story to be about Florida. You know that, like, and I'll tell you that, yes, 5/6 of the original band were living in Florida. 4 of them were Florida natives. Dickie Betts is from Palm Beach County and grew up in Manatee. Duane and Greg Allman are mostly from Daytona Beach. Their mom lived in the house at 100 Van Avenue until the day she died. Troy and I have a couple pictures in front of it, actually, in various trucks that way. Butch Trucks is from Jacksonville. Barry Oakley is living in Jacksonville. He's originally from Chicago, but I call him a Florida native because you come down to Florida and you declare it, and then you know, that's it. Maybe not Florida native, I call him a Southerner, actually. He's not Florida native. That's 30 years. Minimum if you're a transplant. That's my estimation. You guys agree with that? 30 years you've lived here, you can declare yourself a Floridian, I think. Because I get Susie Beattie in on that list too. And if there was ever a Floridian in this world, it's my mother. So anyway, back to Florida. So I saw this, and then Jaimoe's from Mississippi, the black drummer, the drummer who happens to be black, I guess the best way to say it, but he's from Mississippi. They meet in Jacksonville, Florida at a house. 2844 Riverside Avenue, also a place where Troy and I have visited. And they jam for the first time, all but Greg, who happens to be in Los Angeles, California, fulfilling the terms of another record contract. And they have this 3-hour jam. Story is Duane got in the doorway and said, anybody who's not going to play in my band is going to have to fight your way out. They all laughed. They knew that was not that what they were all in it at that point. And they called Greg and said, get your butt back here from LA and literally come write some songs and send it someplace. That's a quote I use in the book. Stole it right from Greg's autobiography, I think. Didn't steal it, I footnoted it very well. But the story is a Southern story. It is a Southern story, and when you look at bands of their era, as soon as they break through, all of these other Southern bands start to break through. And I'm not just talking like Marshall Tucker Band and Lynyrd Skynyrd, but I am talking about them. But a whole bunch of Southern musicians, but they were already doing this in Alabama, and in Georgia, and in North Florida, and in South Carolina. The connection I think I found the most is it's a small town Southern story. It's not rural, okay? Because, you know, Daytona Beach isn't rural, it's just a small town, right? When you look at the towns of Southern rock and roll, not Southern rock, the genre, but it's the same thing. They're all close to something to do with the federal government. In Northwest Alabama is the TVA, and Huntsville, Alabama with NASA. Most of Florida is military bases where you're attached or NASA related. So the feds are providing jobs, people are coming, you know, to the jobs and doing, and all of these cultures are meeting in the South. And they have this proximity to the wellspring of music, which is really African American music mixed somewhat with European tradition, which is jazz. You know, so it's like happening in the South. Now it's happening in the cities too, right? And Southern culture is very insular, and you know, like aunts and uncles and cousins aren't necessarily related. That's true of immigrant cultures too, and that are living in cities. There is something about Southern culture, dislocated from rural, where they get into cities or small towns and they begin to play music together. You cannot segregate influence. So you may keep people apart in the public sphere, but white folk are still listening to black music. So it's a Southern thing, you know, like ultimately. And Florida, by the way, is very, very, very much a part of the American South in this era. I think we're so cosmopolitan now, y'all are. You think you're not, but I mean, I look at this, and this is very, very much how the American South works. And we don't think about Florida that way often, you know? Long answer to your short question. You take a breath now.
Get some water. So now this is like a smooth transition to the actual content of the book. So if you want, you could give us a little bit more context before the band finally formed in Jacksonville in March 26, 1969. But basically walk us through from that moment forward up until at Fillmore East, and we could talk a little more about that.
Yeah. So Duane and Greg Allman are brothers. Surprise, surprise, right? Their father had been murdered. He was a D-Day veteran, survived D-Day and was shot basically by a drifter. And their mother, her family was in Nashville. More or less, she relocates to Daytona Beach and becomes a CPA. And the boys end up spending a couple different stints in a military school outside of Nashville. Hated it so much, by the way. The alumni of that school does not want to have a marker for the Allman brothers there because of how much they besmirch the old Castle Heights Military Academy. Isn't that awesome? Like, that's just the greatest story. To me, I think it's just awesome. And by the way, Castle Heights is now like the city of Lebanon, not Lebanon. It's their city hall too, so it's not even military academy anymore, you know? So they go up there, they end up in Daytona Beach and get the music bug. The best way to say it. Anybody in here, I'm sure several of you also in that stage in your life got the music bug. And all of us took it to the point where like, yeah, I'm not gonna do this for peanuts anymore, or I'm not very good or whatever else. Duane drops out of high school. Geraldine, their mother, insists Greg graduate as the backup plan. According to stories, Duane would do Greg's homework for him, and they would go on the road and stuff like that. They become the Allman Joys, pretty cheeky, pretty clever, and they take to the road. And the stories that I have in the book are about musicians in Florida who encounter them, who realized, oh, these guys are for real. They're different. They wear their hair different. Gary Rosington of Lynyrd Skynyrd, I got quoted, because we were just chubby high school boys playing baseball. They were rock stars. They had long hair and they wore leather and blah, blah, blah. They go to Nashville. Actually, they first go to New York for an audition. Fail that. They go to Nashville and record, and really nothing comes of it. They're touring around. They're very frustrated. They go to LA and sign with a major record company, and they release 2 records in a group called Hourglass. And this is It's like Tom Jones psychedelic to me. It's just, I think it's absolutely terrible. And I have friends, my advisor, my dissertation, like, no, there's some good stuff on there. And I suppose there is. But Duane quits that band and leaves, despite the fact that he's still under contract with the band. That's why Greg's in LA when the band starts. And Duane moves back to Muscle Shoals, Alabama. First he goes to Daytona Beach, then he goes to Muscle Shoals. For those of y'all who've heard these stories a million times, I will say I do not believe Rick Hall's story that Duane pitched a 10 and waited for his turn. Duane had girls all over this country, and he'd actually, like, his first kid was fathered when he was like 16. I'm just gonna tell you, Duane Allman would have found his way to some old bed he'd soon be sharing, to quote his brother. I just cannot believe he pitched a 10. I might only be telling the story to like 3 people in this room right now. Who's heard the Pup Tent story? Everybody's like, okay, so we got a couple. I think it's crap, y'all. I really do. Okay. Side note: Duane finds a way in the door to play on a session at Fame for Rick Hall. Eventually, does a session with Rick Hall on Wilson Pickett's cover of the Beatles' "Hey Jude," and it is a massive top 20 hit. Some of y'all may remember it from early 1969, fall 1968. It was all over the radio. And Duane plays a solo that earns him a record contract, earns him the right to form that band in Jacksonville. And they moved in together in Jacksonville, got busted for weed and guns, believe it or not. Have to haul butt out of town and go up to Macon, which is where they basically end up headquartered for most of their early years. And they do the normal thing. We're gonna record an album, go tour it, record an album, go tour it. Eventually it'll break the charts. We'll send out a single. Those of y'all from that era. I mean, honestly, most of us. I grew up in the single era too. You know, pre-streaming. And their albums aren't working. And nobody's buying them. But everybody loves their concerts, and that's what I know. And I wrote about in the book. When you listen and you read the reception, you're like, why isn't it they're breaking? It's because the records don't sound like they sound live. And the live sound is what everybody appreciates. So fast forward to September of 1970, about a year and a half into the band. They've got 2 records out, and they make the decision that, well, really, basically, powers that be want to break the band up. Nothing's ever going to make it out of the South. Phil Walden has said, you know, maybe they were too musical for the world. I'll say I feel the same way sometimes. Like, it's just too, you know. Maybe the reason you don't understand is because it's just too musical, you know, and all these different things. So the option was, we want to record a live album, and we want to do it on the biggest stage we can think of, biggest being most important, not large, Fillmore East in New York City. To set up, if anybody's ever been to those theaters in New York, or any of them, you know, tight, going this way. Usually 2 tiers of balconies and a you know, long row. Beautiful, gorgeous. This was a former Yiddish theater, part of the vaudeville scene. And they recorded they recorded 4 shows. Most of the music comes from 2 of those shows. On the very last, actually, yeah, the last show basically, the last 2 shows of the whole run. Beautifully recorded, and the fact of the matter is they were 100% live on that stage doing it. So, you know, this is like John Coltrane going to Rudy Van Gelder's studio. He hits record, and Coltrane comes out with A Love Supreme, you know, and boom. That's literally what's happening, except there's 2,500 New Yorkers staring at you. Now, they are in 1971 state of mind, so they're a little more tamped down maybe than a little less rowdy. Literally 100% live, no overdubs on the record. Their choice, and it all boiled down. They break up the band and went, we're going to go stand in front of people and record live, and we're going to put that out and hope that it takes. So there's the decision to record the record. Let me keep going? Yeah. Okay. So that's Fillmore record. So that's at Fillmore East. So the record gets recorded. It's 4 nights. One of the very interesting things about the story is they were the middle band on that bill. Johnny Winter was the headliner, and he goes out Thursday night, which is like the rehearsal night, and he comes off stage. Well, he goes out after the Allman Brothers, and apparently afterwards his manager Johnny decided he's not going after the Allman Brothers anymore. They set too high a bar for the headliner. So they switch slots, and what that does on Friday and Saturday night in particular, the late shows, they get to go longer. And in doing so, now again, I got chastised by a friend for throwing out statements about the length of their jams, about that that means excellence. A lengthy jam equals excellence, and that's not true. You know what I mean? Like that's not true for everybody either. So the length part then becomes, what are they trying to do with music? We go back to sound, right? So that Fillmore East is 4 records, it's a double album. It's got 7 songs on it. 2 of them are close to 20 minutes. You Don't Love Me and Whipping Post is over 20 minutes. You Don't Love Me is almost 20 minutes. Another one is more than 12, In Memory of Elizabeth Reed. It's an instrumental. Another instrumental, 5 minutes. It's just got this quality to it. A lot of quality in a small quantity, if you will. But what does the length of the music mean? Is that allowed them to stretch out based on what they were feeling at the moment. It did also take a little pressure off. It's harder, I know this from experience, to get in and get out on a solo in a short amount of time on a call. It's hard to warm up and flow and tell a story and a statement. They needed that space, and it absolutely worked. So they get off, they recorded the record, they decide no overdubs. Now, a lot of live records, beloved live records, are very heavily overdubbed. The Grateful Dead's Skull and Roses record, pretty heavily overdubbed. Waiting for Columbus by Little Feat, overdubbed. Get Your Yayas Out by the Rolling Stones, overdubbed. They didn't fix a dang thing, nor did they have anything they needed to fix, believe it or not, in what's on the album. They patched 2 versions of You Don't Love Me together, right about the split between Duane and actually right at the split. That's where Play All Night comes from. It's actually from the early show Saturday, I think, or the late show Friday. Weird, it's like early in the run, even instead of this definitive thing. Anyway, no overdubs. They decide as a record company, we're going to release a double album. This is what Capricorn Records, Phil Walden says to Atlantic, who is a partner, and they're distributing the record. There's a lot of issues here with dirty pool business, because partners own the record label. Phil Walden's their manager and their publisher and their booking agent. The Allman brothers do end up losing a lot of money over the years due to that. But Walden says, we're putting out a double album for a single album price, because this band is the people's band. And that, by the way, is like my favorite thing they've ever been called. And I spent a decent amount of time trying to find official, that's what they called it, the people's band. And it really wasn't. It was like this unofficial thing. But we're going to sell a double album of high quality music for a single album price. And it was a gamble that worked 100% across the board. The record gets released in July of 1971. By October, it hit gold. It sold 500,000 units. And by October 29th, Duane Allman was killed in a motorcycle accident, right after they had gotten notice of that. So he had spent this meteoric rise from 1965, 66, going to Nashville and failing to, going to New York and Nashville and failing to the biggest stage in rock, Fillmore East. And when it's all over, accolades come. He tells his roadie, no more beans for breakfast, and he dies on a motorcycle. I mean, is there more rock and roll way to go either than flaming out on a motorcycle accident? And Don Bonnet, his bandmate, doesn't do it the next year. So it was a gamble. It was an all or nothing, break the band. This was it. And it worked. And the record sold. Just curious how many people in your own at Fillmore East or some version of it or have over their times. It's a large number of people. It is one of the defining records in the rock canon. It's in the Library of Congress as one of its designations for stuff. It's legit. And by the way, I've listened to this album a lot over the years. A lot as I wrote the book. I was like, all this other noise, pun intended, what is this record saying? And just to get a sense, right? Just for my own, what are they trying to, get across? Improvisation, creativity, community with music, communication. These are all things that Duane wanted to do when he formed his band. He needed the right bandmates to support that endeavor. He needed industry support, which came in with management, which becomes an issue. He needs to capture an audience. And he understands the final pillar to this is that the South is where all of this, he has to be based in the South to make this happen. And for the most part, that band continued to be based in the South. Most of them stayed in the South. Greg was the one, he moved to California several times over the time.
My final question as we wrap up here is, what's the legacy of Duane Allman and this album and the broader band?
The legacy, the very first one, right, is the ability for Southern musicians of the rock musicians, not Southern rock like, Leonard Skinner, but musicians who play rock and roll, blues-based rock from the South had a chance to do something. I think it really did reinvent Southern music in its time. And those of y'all who lived in that era and lived in the South at the time, you know that that's true. It was what was happening. Jimmy Carter, I think, as president, was very much a part of the Allman Brothers' legacy. Of course, they funded a very huge benefit concert for him early on. The true legacy, though, is the band that outlived him by 43 years. We have this idea that a band is John, Paul, George, and Ringo, and that's it, right? Bands are this one kind of lineup, but the jazz bands, Benny Goodman Orchestra might still be going. Duke Ellington Orchestra continues to go. But even then, before Duke and Benny Goodman and others died, they were leading bands that changed members, that fit the construct of the tune, the song, the way that they approached it. In the rock and roll era, we've done it too, but for the most part, the songs are very constructed. They're not excursions. They don't extend out jazz-wise or anything else. So the Allman Brothers, I think, are a little bit new to that. I call them an American institution. They're done. 2014, they hung it up. Ironically, it was Duane's death date. They played their final notes in 2014. I don't think it was ironic. I think it was intentional. But Greg Allman died Butch Trucks committed suicide in early 2017, and Greg Allman died in May of that year. So there's two members alive, Jaimoe, who is still playing sometimes, some recently, and Dickie Betts, who is not, but is down in Manatee and lives down in Bradenton County, I think. Manatee County, lives down in Bradenton. I don't think he's in Sarasota County. And there are countless bands who have been influenced by them that are still playing. Derek Truxton, Warren Haynes, Ann O'Teal Burbridge, and Mark Quinones, all who were in the final lineup of the band, are all playing. Mark plays with the Doobie Brothers. He's the percussionist. And Derek has his own band. He played here recently. Warren is in Government Mule. So I think the legacy is the band. The legacy is the approach. I find their story of recovering from these shocking deaths in 1971 and 72 to be they've been really inspirational to me in my entire life. That's not a lie. First song I listen to when I lose somebody close is the song Greg wrote after Duane died, called Ain't Wasting Time No More. It's like this little talisman to me, like, okay, I'm here, I got a responsibility to carry forward. And that is a mindset that band and its ancillary folks has had, because Government Mule lost members, and Tedeschi Trucks Band has lost members, crucial members, and they keep going. And they keep to the spirit of the music. It's just, that's probably the biggest one for Bob, Yeah.
Well, now we'll get into the Q&A session, but before I open the floor for questions, I just want to again thank you, Dr. Beatty, for having me here and asking you questions.
Great, isn't it?
It's an absolute honor. Thank you. And I want to thank you all for taking the time out of your day and chatting with us. It's a true pleasure. And if you want to hear more about this, obviously get his book right now, but
Two.
just us chatting about this, search up Ninth History Cast on Google, and it's the first thing that'll come up. It's episode 24 on that podcast feed, and you will listen to us chat more about it, so it's awesome. So thank you again. So any questions?
Somebody got a question?
Okay.
I can also repeat it.
I'm a huge fan, and this was just awesome.
Thank you.
I have so many questions, but I'll just go with this one. If you look across the Allman Brother fans, do you see any kind of common denominator among fans? Any characteristics?
Here, I'm gonna do the mic again. Okay, so y'all heard the question. I'm always used to repeating questions. Characteristics common to Allman Brothers fans. Give me a minute on that one. It'll come out in a little bit, and maybe I'll end up saying it there. You know, is that coming through here? Nice. Okay. Cool. Maybe the world's ending. You know, there is something that binds us as Allman Brothers fans for sure, and it has to do. I think it has to do with what we like to listen to in music. But the weird thing, actually, now that I'm thinking about this, I usually ask people like, "What's your favorite, song?" And everybody's got a different one almost. So it tells you that there's an adventure spirit, different from, I'll say this, from the Grateful Dead, who's a band that I enjoy. The Allman Brothers have intent with their jams. They don't just wander and traipse down the garden and hope that they stumble into, something magical. They often do, and fans, do that. I don't like that as much as somebody says, "All right, we're here, we're going there. How we get there, we may do a lot of zigging and zagging." So there's a patience there too. I think in an Allman Brothers fan to get to the payoff. It's a good question, and I'm going to be pondering that one. You got any answers on that one, Troy? All right. Who else has a question? Yes, sir. I'll repeat the question.
One of my favorite rock and roll song of all time is Layla by Derek.
Amen.
And Duane had a big role in music.
Yeah.
I've read everything there is to read, all the Allman Brothers biographies, read it all. I've never heard anyone say that it was Duane's idea to add the piano coda to the end of the song.
Okay. Yeah. So let me back up a bit. That's a good place to launch to. Layla is Eric Clapton's masterpiece. Y'all know the song. Duane was Derek the Dominoes was Eric Clapton and 3 Americans. They were part of Delaney and Bonnie's band at the time. Carl Radel played bass, Jim Gordon played drums, and Bobby Whitlock played keys. They show up in Miami at Criteria Studios, which was also the Allman Brothers' second home studio. And they're having a hard time. And eventually, Tom Dowd, the producer, brokers Duane and Eric meeting. And it is Eric Clapton showing up to play at an Allman Brothers show, unannounced. And apparently Duane is playing, and he looks down and he sees Eric Clapton, who at that time is the top guitarist in the world, the biggest thing. And he literally stops playing in the middle of a jam because he's like, "Holy crap, my biggest influence is sitting at my feet." Dickie Betts notices it, who also loves Clapton. Dickie fills in until he too looks over and sees that it's Eric Clapton, and they both freeze kind of live. It's a cool story. They go back and jam, and eventually Duane joins the Layla sessions. Now, what he's talking about is at the end of Layla, there's a really pretty piano interlude at the end that was tacked on at the end. No, that wasn't Duane's idea. That was actually Rita Coolidge's riff that Jim Gordon stole from her and put his name on it. Duane's idea was to speed up Layla a little bit, and also that initial 6-note riff. That was Duane. And that's an Albert King song called "As the Years Go Passing By." And it's the first lyric. He says, "There is nothing I can do." That's what Duane cops to throw that in. But he did not do the coda. Now, the final story I'll say on Layla is Eric Clapton, and this is in the book, Eric offered him the opportunity to join the band. It was going to be a massive payday for Duane, who at that point was cruising around in a Winnebago with his bandmates. And he turned Eric Clapton down to stay in the Allman Brothers, who were absolutely unsuccessful and really couldn't rub two nickels together. So I think that's remarkable to me, and that's what I put in the book. All the other books talk about Layla as this great star turn for Duane, and it is. He's playing with the master, and he's blowing him away, frankly. Eric Clapton, I don't think ever touched the heights that he hit on that record ever again. And he wanted Duane in the band, and Duane said, no, I really like playing with my mates. So, good question. Other thoughts or questions? So the key for those of you who are rolling in late, I'm going to be going to the back to sign books. My hope is that you will, really the admission price is to buy one book, period. But if you'll buy two and give one away, it's simply how I keep this going. Plus, frankly, I hope we've interested you enough. I'm pretty sure you're going to enjoy the story, because I really did think about each of you in this room as an audience type as I approached it. Because eventually I stopped reading books for content and I started reading for how they rolled out stories and how they said things. And that's why I got the difference with the journalists always qualifying sources. I started that and I was like, this just doesn't work. He puts too much in there. Do we have a final question? Okay, we'll go with this gentleman, and then we'll come over here, and then Troy and I will play a quick song.
I think you ought to do a little bit of audience participation by asking who's the oldest and who's the youngest person in here, and why is the youngest person here, not the kids. The youngest Allman Brothers, Duane Allman fan.
Yeah. Well, I think it's those two over there, actually. I would be hoping. We keep trying for that. I mean, I understand the instinct. Does somebody want to acknowledge being the oldest person in the room? 19, let's go back. So Duane Allman was born in 1946. Anybody before 1946? One person, Mark Line. He wins farthest from the pin. Thank you, Mark. Wonderful. Okay, let's do, well, 20 years ago is 2003, right? So anybody born after 2003? There she is. There's the youngest, my niece, Ava. Wait, Ava, nice shirt too, Ava. Very good. Good job. So we give Ava a big hand for that. Now, Ava's here because she's related as well, and she's going to sing. You going to sing? All right, nice. All right, final question. Yes, sir.
Did you talk to any of the fans that saw them playing before, for free? We used to go into Piedmont Park.
Okay, so this question is about one of the key stories of the Allman Brothers is the fact that they went on the road for 300 days a year, and if they weren't being paid for a gig, they would set up at a park and play. It was a regular occurrence from their very earliest days. I'm assuming, were you one of those Piedmont Parkers then?
Piedmont Park, every chance I heard, and then after hours, they would go down to the IHOP, and you could see the smoke in the air. You knew they were there.
So, Piedmont Park is in Atlanta, and they did it a lot. Piedmont Park is designed by Frederick Law Olmsted. So the guy did Central Park, all the way down doing parks in Georgia. I think public parks, public gathering spaces are one of the most wonderful American inventions for the very reason that you said. The Allman Brothers would show up, plug in their gear the first time they did it, and they drew 1,000 people. Front cover of the Great Speckled Bird, which I read online. And so they got this very early coverage about how awesome they were. And you know what the continual thing, I'll leave on this one. Jaimoe, again, is one of the drummers in the band. They had two drummers, we haven't even gotten to that. Two guitarists.
Stereo.
Jaimoe, I met him, and besides calling me an observant MFer, which is still the most amazing, he's a jazz man, and jazz people, to call you observant is huge, but the MF is a really important connotation in jazz, and I was called that by a jazz man, and that was really cool. But one of the things he said I got wrote in the book, and one of the things that Miller Francis Jr. wrote about on the very first Piedmont Park thing, Lester Bangs wrote in the first interview for Rolling Stone, was and Jaimoe said it, he said, the band that he played in, right, They were white guys who could play black music that didn't sound like it was wrong. They had, and he doesn't call it soul, he doesn't call it rhythm and blues, it was just, he goes, you got it right, in the quote, it's on my YouTube, he goes, if Mick Jagger sings he goes, he's great, but if he sings Johnny Be Good, he says, throw him out the blanking window, right? That was his joke. So, and Jaimoe, by the way, is not the sole source of this, right? Like, the history isn't just one person's account, and you're like, well, that's history, that's a fact. Jaimoe said that a lot of times, and I had to go through and figure out, what is it that he's talking about? Well, lots of other people said the same thing. This is not a made up thing. All right, you ready? Troy? All right, thanks you guys. I'm gonna do sell books. We're gonna do a song.